Well, welcome to Macquarie University and welcome to our city campus. My name is Eric Knight. I'm the Executive Dean of Macquarie Business School, and I'd like to welcome you to the land of or acknowledge that we meet on the land of the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation and pay my respects to elders past, present and emerging. This is part of a series that we host once a quarter as part of Macquarie Business School. And it's relevant, I suppose, as we think about the kinds of conversations that have been filling the news about the role of universities, the roles of business school in our community. A lot of that has focused on skills and training of our students, which is indeed important. But I think another part of business schools is also to be a forum for ideas. Difficult ideas, challenging ideas, ideas that are important to our community, and few are as important as the green transition that we're going to have the privilege to talk about tonight. So I'm delighted to have such a wonderful crowd. This is not a one-off, so if you are interested in these things, if you're one of our alums, we'll have another one of these in 3 months' time, just after Easter, with Catherine Livingston, who is another alum from this school, Macquarie Business School, Lynn Cobley, another member of council at Macquarie University, and Jason Johnson, alum from this school, talking about boards, board governance, and how to manage the complexity that we face in organisations from the vantage point of the board. But more generally, Macquarie Business School is in a wonderful place at the moment. This week, for those of you who are alums, you'll appreciate that this is orientation week, so we've been welcoming students on campus. It's been a particularly exciting year because we've had a lot of enrolments in our new Bachelor of Commerce and Bachelor of Business. But we've also had wonderful satisfaction rates in our undergraduate programs. I think our quilt scores now, which are the measure of student experience, are the top in the Sydney Basin in the order of about 10 percentage points. Strong rankings in the QS World Rankings for our courses, number 1 and number 2 in the country. Great employment outcomes for our students. And I'm very pleased to see in the latest Shanghai rankings, which is a research rankings for research in business, Macquarie is now ranked number 19 in the world in business administration. So we're in good health. We're fortunate to be able to host wonderful events like this. And I'd like to invite our Deputy Dean Research and Innovation, Leonie Tickle, to start proceedings and introduce tonight's panel. So thank you, Leonie.
Thank you, Eric. A very warm welcome to all of you. It should be an absolutely terrific event tonight. This event builds on our expertise in the green transition, and particularly our expertise in energy markets and our newly launched Macquarie Business School-led Centre for Transforming Energy Markets. And we've also recently been part of a Treasury submission jointly with Cyan Ventures on sustainable finance. And so we're very excited to be continuing that conversation with our wonderful guest speakers tonight. It should be a really terrific, lively discussion. Very much looking forward to it. So let me now introduce our speakers to the stage. If you could join me, Guy, Kerry and Martijn. We have Kerry Schott, who's currently a Director of AGL, Chair of the Carbon Market Institute and a member of the Aware Super Direct Asset Committee. She was recently Chair of the Energy Security Board and of the Net Zero Emission Board in New South Wales and the Advisory Committee to Energy Corporation New South Wales. Kerry's also been a Chair and Non-Executive Director of a number of unlisted companies in the infrastructure sector. These include the NBN, Moorebank Intermodal, now National Terminals, WestConnex, Sydney Metro and ARTC, and she's also served on a number of advisory committees and policy reviews. Previously, as an executive, Kerry was Managing Director of Sydney Water, and she spent 15 years as an investment banker after being an academic and public servant. And Kerry holds a doctorate from Oxford University and was awarded an Order of Australia in 2015 for services to business and commerce. I'm exhausted, Kerry. Welcome, Kerry. Wonderful to have you here. We also have Martijn Wilder. So Martijn is a world leader in climate law and sustainable investing. He's retained over many years the accolade of the world's leading climate change lawyer and the star individual by Chambers Global Law Guide. He was head of Baker McKenzie's global climate law and finance practice for 20 years, and he continues to play a key role with Australia's clean energy finance institutions. Currently, Martijn is founder and CEO of Pollination, and he's the chair of the National Reconstruction Fund and Renewable Energy and Energy Efficiency Partnership. And in 2012, he was awarded Member of the Order of Australia in recognition for service to environmental law, particularly in the area of climate change. Welcome, Martijn. And Dr. Guy Debelle is an advisor to the Investment Committee of Australian Retirement Trust and a non-executive director at TVAN. He's also co-chair of the ASFI Taxonomy Technical Experts Group, which is developing the sustainable finance taxonomy for the Australian economy. Guy was the Deputy Governor of the Reserve Bank of Australia from 2016 until 22. Prior to that, Assistant Governor Financial Markets from 2007 to 2016. After leaving the RBA, Guy worked at Fortescue Future Industries as CFO and non-executive director, and he's previously held roles at the International Monetary Fund, Bank for International Settlements, and the Australian Treasury. He's been a visiting Professor of Economics at MIT, and he's currently Honorary Professor of Economics at University of Adelaide. Welcome, Guy. What an eminent panel we have. It's going to be such fun to hear from you all. Really looking forward to it. So before we get started with the panel discussion, a quick note, we're using Mentimeter to collect your audience questions. So please scan the QR codes that are dotted around the room, that will be on the screen. Please put your questions there as we're doing the panel. You don't need to wait for our Q&A at the end. Those questions will be moderated and they'll be posed to our panellists after we have our initial panel discussion. So please do go ahead and do that whenever you're ready. So today's panel will discuss the transition of the Australian energy markets, and I'd like to start by posing a question to all of our panellists, and that is, where does Australia fit in this global challenge? So we're a country that has a strong endowment of natural resources, minerals, renewable energy potential, but we're also an economy that's still largely powered by fossil fuels, and we're a large exporter of coal and gas. So I'd like to begin by asking all of you, where do you see Australia in the green transition? Where are we in the transition? Where should we be? What have the barriers been? Are they political, social, financial, technical? A simple question. I'll hand to you, Kerry.
I'm not sure I'm the right person. I'm not sure I'm the right person to ask that question of, because I think in terms of the energy transition, it's very patchy. We're actually making a lot of progress in some areas, but it's not in all areas and not fast enough. And I wanted to focus largely tonight on rooftop solar and batteries, where Australia is by far the leading take-up in the world, like by daylight between us and the next jurisdiction. But we're still having huge troubles in managing it within the grid and within the system. So others will be able to learn from us if we ever get it sorted out. With the large-scale renewables and carbon, I'll leave it to Guy and Martijn to comment on that. Thanks.
Over to you, Martijn.
I agree with Kerry. I think we're in a really interesting dynamic environment. So I think, Australia for a long time has been criticised as being a laggard in a lot of areas, yet people see this energy market as incredibly dynamic and watching very closely what's going to happen. And I think it's very patchy and there are many different things going on. We've got different levels of transition in parts of the system. We've got volatility. We've got a lot of politics still being played out. We've got old kit collapsing, as we saw in Victoria this week, and creating issues there. And so I think it's a very dynamic market. I mean, the one thing I'd say is that, and we'll probably get on this a little bit later on, is that, the focus on the energy market also tends to be a lot on generation. Yet I think there's a lot happening in Australia around how do you actually build new generation capacity, particularly around building solar kit, about building panels in Australia, about building wind turbines in Australia. There's a lot of, one of the roles you said I've got is just chairing and setting up the National Reconstruction Fund. On the first day, I got 7 people who approached me wanting to manufacture solar panels in Australia. So the dynamics and how quickly that's happening is pretty interesting. And I think the other thing I'd just say is that, there's the other interesting dynamic is we've gone from a lot of people, being strong advocates of renewable energy and wind and solar to now wanting to stop that on a planning basis because of different visual effects, and so that's a real challenge because we've got this dynamic now where people can't get approval fast enough, and yet there's now increasing opposition to renewables for various reasons, some of which are valid, some of which are not. But that just creates an even greater complexity because we just have to plan a project takes time and costs a lot of money. The longer it gets delayed, the harder it is to execute. So I think there's a lot of interesting dynamics, but if we can get it right, as Kerry says, will be a really important example.
Yeah, I mean, the bottom line is we have a huge potential here, but at the moment, that potential is broadly unrealised. Australia has the best sun and the best wind. You might think, well, that's sort of obvious. But no, it actually turns out we have really good sun and really good wind. And a number of places, those two things are in the same place, which is fantastic. So that's something that we have, which the Japanese, for instance, don't have, or the Koreans don't have. The other thing which is often overlooked in this is that we have land to put that stuff on. I'll leave offshore wind out for the moment, but we have plenty of land to deploy that on. But that, as said, it still sits in terms of potential. And if you think about our potential is in producing green electrons. Then through renewable power, then the question is, what do we do with them? And but before we get too hung up on what we're doing with them, it'd be useful to have a few more of them. And to some extent, what we do with them is more of a luxury problem to have once we have more of them, which we don't have at the moment. But we have the capacity to do that. And so then the question is, well, why don't we have more capacity? Why don't we have more generation capacity wherever that happens to be, so then we can worry about what we do with those green electrons and how we both use them for our internal purposes and also that huge export energy or green energy potential that we have. And there are a few reasons why we don't have that. One is we had a decade of underinvestment at least a decade of underinvestment because we had a hostile political environment. We still actually got more than some people realise in terms of renewable generation capacity, including particularly, as Kerry said, rooftop solar. But we have to make up for that, and we can't just address that overnight. That's going to take some time. We have a more conducive political framework, I'd say now, and a lot of the building blocks are in place, but we're not following through on those building blocks anywhere near as fast. And there might be a range of reasons, but a lot of it comes down to the opposition about where we're going to put the stuff, which in some sense is a valid question, but it's got, if it's not here, then where is often a question which I think gets overlooked. So it's easy to oppose a project in this particular, it's a NIMBYism to an nth degree. It's easy to oppose this particular project because it has an impact on the environment. It's like, well, okay, fine, but then where's the alternative project going to be? And I think that requires, I would say, political leadership as much as anything to cut through that debate. I think a useful analogy here, and we can sort of see it happen, WestConnex out here. The government here built WestConnex, and I said, if you got a smokestack next to your house somewhere in the inner west, well, tough. You ended up with a smokestack next to your house. If you get a transmission line planned across your property, then that seems to have a much higher level of resistance to it than, so the government is happy to do, not happy, but they will do compulsory acquisition. They will build roads wherever they want to build a road, but when it comes to a transmission line, then they seem to hit any number of problems, which in other spheres, political leadership seems to cut through. So I think the biggest inhibitor, I'd say, at the moment is really around getting stuff approved. And, the projects are there, the potential's there, but the capacity to realise that potential requires that approval process. I don't say it doesn't need to be there, but it just needs to be a lot more streamlined and a lot greater sense of this is the overall plan and this is how that fits in it, which is a political leadership problem rather than just addressing each of those problems in a piecemeal fashion.
Great, thank you all. And you've touched on a point there, Guy, that I want to explore a bit more with you. The fact that Australia has such great resources, critical minerals, solar, wind, the impact that we can have through being an exporter of clean energy is many times the impact that we would have from doing our own domestic decarbonisation. Could you just speak a bit more to what you see as the potential of Australia's role in that, and also how we mobilise the capital to deliver on some of that.
Yeah, I mean, so as I said earlier, we're lucky, as you said, we have a lot of energy exports to the rest of the world at the moment, which are fossil fuel intensive. We are very lucky that with that probably having a very finite life, particularly for coal, that we are sitting on a huge opportunity to replace that with a green energy export. So the Japanese and Japan and Korea are the most obvious countries for us to export that green energy to. One open question is how, and as I think the easiest way to think about it, as I was saying earlier, is we generate the green electron. How do we get that to the Japans and the Koreas of the world? With all due respect to Mike Cannon-Brookes, probably not on a cable, but there are many other ways to get it there. And you look at something like green iron, where we have a lot of iron ore, we have a lot of renewable energy potential where that iron ore is. You combine those two things together and we ship green iron. Probably not steel and probably not in the form of cars, but we can ship those green electrons in the form of green iron to other countries of the world. So critical minerals, as you mentioned, we have a very large share of a lot of the critical minerals in the world. The question is, how far downstream do we go in terms of that value add? I think we can probably do better than just the dig and ship that we've traditionally done. We can add some value. As it doesn't mean we're going to get into the chip making business anytime soon. I think the Taiwanese have probably got that one locked up, and the Chinese have got that locked up. But we can add value to those critical minerals because we can combine renewable generated green electrons with those critical minerals, process them to some degree. The open question, including particularly for the fund that Martijn was referencing earlier, his chair of, is how far we go down that path. But there are any number of forms that we can export that renewable energy capacity that we have to the rest of the world, and it's an open question of how. And we're lucky to have that wide range of opportunity to us, but it all comes back to, well, that's fine, but we need to have more green electrons in the first place.
And how do we foster the investment to make this happen? I know you've spoken about the role of the superannuation industry in perhaps being a driver of these kinds of initiatives. And, perhaps you could speak to the effect on the economy that you see arising from this, large need for capital in this space.
To some extent, I think the finance question, to be frank, is actually the easiest part to solve. At the moment, I would say there is more capital looking to deploy into this space than there are projects to deploy into. And, going back to the permitting challenge that Martijn was referring to earlier, if you've got a project and it's going to take extra 2 or 3 years to get that project off and running, from a cost of, that really decreases the returns on that project if it's delaying those returns for another 2 or 3 years. So I think, as I said, there's a large pool of capital looking to invest in green all around the world. So I really don't think we're going to have a problem in terms of attracting capital. The challenge we have at the moment is putting the projects, economic projects, but those projects on the ground, in front of the investors. As I said, the investors are looking for them. There's a shortage of supply of investable propositions rather than the capital to finance them, is my assessment.
Thank you. And Kerry and Martijn, of course, feel free to chime in if you'd like on that topic, or otherwise I'll move. Go ahead, Martijn.
Sure, yeah. So I have a slightly different take. I don't think the capital's that easy. I think the capital at a particular point in the capital stack is easy, but it's the early stage capital that's really hard. So I think at the moment, Australia sits in a really interesting place, right? So as Guy says, we've got lots of solar, lots of wind, lots of minerals. We're very good at growing. We're very good at digging. We're not very good at taking it beyond that. We have a situation where we've got an agreement with the US and the UK on defence. That's at a high level. Underneath that, there's a lot more about combining your resources. So the UK and Australia have got a critical minerals deal. Australia and the US have got a critical minerals deal, although it's hard to work out what that is at the moment. There's also a critical minerals deal between Germany and Australia. You're seeing a lot of dialogue at the moment between those getting IRA funding and wanting to get NRF funding. So we're doing a lot of talk between the US government and us about opportunities there. You're seeing the Japanese with their $173 billion on their IRA equivalent, looking at what can be done here. As Guy says, so you look at the Japanese economy, that is the only way for them to decarbonise is either nuclear or hydrogen. There is no other way. And so they are very actively looking at hydrogen in Australia and other places rather than going nuclear. And then as Guy says, how do you actually transport it and how do you ship it? And so finding the solution to ship that's also absolutely critical. I still believe there's a role for Mike's cable, but we'll leave that aside. As I think, there's a lot of cables that flow across jurisdictional boundaries, and I think that is actually going to be part of it as well. But I think the challenge that I see out there is that it's very hard to get capital into the earliest parts of the project. So none of the super funds in Australia are really that active or prepared to actually take that risk. They want, because of the sole purpose test, they want a lot of these projects de-risked. They don't want to invest until the project is at a particular stage. And so what we are hoping with the NRF to do is to really invest in projects at a very early stage that can de-risk that. So I think, and also take a much more ecosystem approach. So we just take one example, the energy sector. So you cannot produce solar panels in Australia at a price that's cheaper than China. You can produce solar panels in Australia that have a point of differentiated, like what 5B and others are doing, that's a little bit different to China, which makes it quite an attractive investment proposition. But ultimately, to bring that cost of solar panels down, you need to invest in other parts of the value chain and bring those costs down. So we have lots of silicon in Australia. We have now people looking at silicon processing in Australia, which is dominant overseas. That's a really interesting space for us to play and invest, and Quinbrook have announced they're looking at something up in Gladstone. That, interestingly, comes with a lot of environmental challenges, but let's assume that you're happy you can work through that. Then silicon wafers for solar panels, China dominates 98% or so of that. There is now people in Australia looking at bringing that production to Australia. So if you can get that value chain together, you can reduce the cost of panels overall, and you can start to manufacture panels, and then you look at the recycling end. So my view is that in some of this energy transition, you don't take an isolated investment approach. You actually take an investment approach across the whole ecosystem, and you try to invest you work out in the value chain of the 8 points in the value chain, where are the 5 that Australia could possibly do, and how can we then use that as to build an export industry overseas. So, ARENA's looked at this very closely. I think we don't have the answers to a lot of this yet, but people are starting to look at it. I think the other thing that's also really interesting in Australia, and we'll come to the public funding later, is we do have real momentum now. Like it was with the Net Zero Transition Authority and what it's trying to do with CFC, with ARENA, with NRF, with NAIF, with all these CIVs being stood up. I learnt this morning there were another 3 CIVs investing in the renewables economy, which I hadn't actually heard of. So it's really interesting how much is going on, and there's a real policy push, both at a federal and state level. So I think that is a different dynamic than 2 years ago, and I think it's quite promising in that regard.
I'd just like to sort of say that when we get all of these things done, they've still got to work beside the existing system, which is frankly creaking and not really keeping up with what needs to be done for these things to be able to get into the grid or get transported and so on. So we've got to pay attention to our existing electricity and gas infrastructure and use that in an efficient way and, in fact, work out how to use it properly.
Great, thanks, Kerry. We'll come back to discuss more of that in a bit. But you touched there on public finance and also policy, Martijn, and obviously we've seen the US put $400 billion over 9 years into clean energy initiatives. Would you like to make any further comment there about just the role of public financing, also public policy in kind of ensuring that we get these bold solutions quickly?
Yeah, look, I don't believe that you'll get a transition without large-scale government support. It just isn't going to happen. So first of all, we have to find the solutions to transition. So if you want to get out of coal, gas, you've got to actually find an alternative, and you've got to find it quickly, and you've got to make it work. So you need a major amount of investment in that. Trying to get Australian corporates, as we've seen this week, and I don't need to name who they are because it's been all over the papers, to pay for technology and adopt it into industrial processes is almost impossible unless the government backs it. And it's funny that the grants given this week to certain people match the exact cost of the technology. There's no investment, right? So you need these public funds to drive this hard. And so what we've seen in the US, there was $15 billion given to automakers in the US just to transform their manufacturing to EVs, which is equivalent, actually, which in US dollars is actually a lot more than the NRF. But you really need this funding to drive. Your other alternatives are to tell the super funds in Australia they have to invest in further downstream in Australia, but and remove some of that sole purpose test. But the irony is, the major investors in Australian transition infrastructure are actually foreign super funds, like the Canadians and others, and Australians are too busy investing in toll roads overseas and airports. If you want to be really frank about it. We need to actually create more momentum here, and I think public funding is critical. So as I said, what's really interesting is, look, Japan, 173 million, the US with their money, the UK Green Deal, although Starmer's now said he's going to reduce the amount of money they're spending significantly. Australia, it's interesting that it's all sort of more, I guess, left-leaning countries that are doing this. But at the end of the day, that transition has to be bankrolled and financed. And just a final comment, it's interesting, if you speak to Jigar Shah, who was running the DOE IRA program, he says he wants to be a B-rated investor. So he wants a lot of his investments to fail. He obviously wants them to succeed, but if he can be B-rated as opposed to AAA rated, that's a good outcome. At the moment, he's above B-rated. But a similar thing, it's very important, I said this earlier at one of the conferences right at the start of the NRF, is that people also have an aversion to losing public money. It's okay to lose public money. So if we have given $15 billion and we make 20 investments and 3 go wrong and 17 hit the lights out, or 7 go wrong and 13 hit the lights out, that's okay, because our role is to try to encourage and form transformation. So we have to be responsible with government money. We also have, under our Act, we've got very clear obligations to transition, to transform. And I'd encourage you to read Section 17 of the NRF Act, which talks about all our objectives, NRF, disadvantaged groups, First Nations, in terms of this transition. And so I think public money is absolutely critical to this. And once you get the momentum and you prove things that they work and that they can come, then you'll get it's much easier to get that momentum.
Yeah, sitting on the investment committee of the second largest super fund in the country, we do actually have some funds deployed into the transition. But part of the challenge, there's 2 challenges. One, so I completely agree with you, though, on the risk appetite. And I said that, I think it makes more sense to think about it exactly the way that you just described, which is more a venture capital approach. Is, you will invest in 20 projects, 5 of them will probably lose your money, 5 of them will return your money, and the other 10 will shoot the lights out. But that will be a 5-year horizon before you start to see that. That poses a problem so super is often branded as patient capital. The reality is it isn't, because the members pay attention every quarter to what their returns are. Some of the My Super benchmarks also have an influence on the super fund's ability to take risk over a sort of medium-term horizon, because if you deviate too far, you're absolutely screwed. So that that sort of change, I think, would help improve the risk appetite. But I do think there is still opportunity within the sector super sector to allocate funds to that early stage. So I meant more when, if you've got a large-scale solar project, you're not going to have much trouble finding a super fund to put into that. It's actually, as Martijn said, it's the early stage stuff which is challenging. And but I also would say that this is not a new problem in the Australian financial sector. We've had a nascent, and that's been generous, venture capital sector here for a very long time. This happens to be the latest incarnation of the problems with that, the green transition. And any number of inquiries as to why that's so, but it is still so. But the opportunities are absolutely out there. But that also means that the government has, I think, as Martijn said, a huge role in de-risking. And if you think about it from an investment point of view, from the government's point of view, if they're in there in that early stage investment and they achieve the sort of outcomes that you just described, then that's actually, from a budgetary point of view, from a fiscal point of view, going to be a net positive for the government over not necessarily all that long a horizon. It's going to be, it's going to be hit to the budget for the first few years while you're investing, the $15 billion in your fund and the other funds. But in all likelihood, those investments are actually going to return, and the government's actually going to be earning income out of them. Not on everyone, and I think that actually is a real challenge, and I see that as a holdover from the financial crisis, and it's a combination of the pink bats and the schools programs. Schools programs because you invested a lot, but someone can say, well, this school didn't need that hall. It's like, yep, fine. But I think that's encouraged a very risk-averse mentality in Canberra, I think, which is, I think, you're seeing elements of in the deployment of capital into this space today.
Can I just comment on financing at a much more macro level and talk about the difficulties of financing self-generating units in households? And at the moment, about 3.7 million houses and business in Australia have got rooftop solar, and they're supplying almost 20% of all the electricity installed capacity, which is absolutely phenomenal, and it's grown very rapidly in the last 5 years, but it's got a few weird characteristics about it to do with the financing of it. Solar panels have become very cheap and electricity has become very expensive, so households have all been investing in solar panels like you wouldn't believe, and probably many of you live in houses with solar panels. Mostly, homes do not invest in storage with it, so they don't have a battery. They frequently don't connect it to the hot water system and have that on in the middle of the day instead of in the evening when power's more expensive. And we're therefore not using the capability of all of that generation at all well. And ironically, the jurisdiction that's got more batteries with its solar is Northern Territory, who have hardly got any solar panels at all as it happens, but the ones they've got, 40% of them have batteries. In South Australia, it's about 18%, and in the rest of the country, New South Wales and Victoria and Queensland, it's between 5 to 7%. And the reason for that is that a lot of households can't afford batteries, and they're the very households who would really benefit from having a battery. And a couple of states have subsidies for batteries, so the government will help you with $5,000 grant or something. EVs will help because they're just a battery on wheels, which is very helpful as long as it can charge in and charge out with the power. But we really need some assistance on that level, although having said that, batteries are becoming much cheaper, and the solar panels that are going in are getting bigger, so we ought to have some storage with them because they're just getting wasted. The other thing that happens is because of the oversupply of electricity in the middle of the day, the demand for electricity on the grid in Adelaide, Brisbane and Perth now in the middle of the day is zero in the summer months. So, come 12 o'clock in Adelaide, if it's sunny, there is absolutely no demand for the grid, and it's very difficult for the distribution system to control its system, and it does not have the kit in its system to be able to do it. And it hasn't been able to do that through the regulator, and we really need to upgrade our regulation to allow this to happen, which would really help. And I think the government could get some cheap runs if it has a look at how to finance at that more micro level, particularly with households that are more in need of help than others. The households that tend to have smart energy systems are people with plenty of money that can pay to get it put in, or they're electricity nerds, or they're both. So.
And the issue here, Kerry, my brother-in-law's an electricity nerd. he likes talking about it a lot. Is the trouble here a kind of bunch of successful but disconnected initiatives that have been positive in one area but then don't link across, or is it different timing of technology development, or what do you see as the main source of this disconnect?
Look, to be fair, I think we've got to recognise, going back to the point that you've got to allow things to fail, we've got to recognise that everybody in this system is learning about how to transition it. Nobody knows for sure. And the electricity operator is trying to cope with a system that has completely changed, from a few big coal-fired power stations to generators coming in all over the place, much of which they can't even see in their system because they're not fitted up for it. And even if they could, I'm not altogether sure they'd know what to do. And hence, people coming along with new generation, who Martijn's trying to finance, having trouble getting connected. So there's all sorts of things, with everybody going up a very steep learning curve. And you've just got to allow people to fail. They will fail. It's going to be stops and starts and a few horrible things happening.
I will ask Nathan to find me the moderated questions, and while he does, thank you, Nathan. Can you guys comment just a bit on the credibility around how we assess kind of true efforts towards sustainability? So, there's been criticism of ESG scores as not being kind of authentic or truly reflective. They vary a lot between different providers of those scores. They have a low correlation between them. There's a lot of concern about greenwashing. How can we ensure that initiatives are credible, are based on credible information, are seen as authentic and credible, and not as a greenwashing exercise?
The sustainable finance taxonomy, that's actually that's what it's about. It's an industry-led initiative initially, at least, now backed by the government, which is developing, saying, okay, for this, if you're building a new building, this is what actually green means. I mean, there are standards out there on that too. But for a manufacturing plant, a mining operation, this is what it means to be sustainable. And that will be an industry-wide definition, so that a bank or a super fund doesn't get to self-define what they think sustainable is. And, they can say, we're, 50% of our book is green. It's like, no, actually, this is the criteria which the industry has got to be. So that taxonomy already exists in Europe and is being applied in the way that the Europeans deploy capital, including into other countries like Australia, which is why we actually need one which actually works for Australia, because like a lot of European financial regulation, it may work for Europe, and even that's debatable, but it sure as hell doesn't work in other jurisdictions. And so and one thing that the Europeans happily ignore in their taxonomy is mining. So they just assume the stuff turns up in Europe, embodied in a car or whatever, and don't pay attention to how it got there, which is fine, but that sort of matters for us a bit. And so, that's why we're covering off things like that. So that will be a consistent, internationally consistent definition of what sustainable finance means, which is very much aimed at addressing all of those challenges that you just raised, Leon.
Yeah, and I think just adding to that, it is complicated, right? Because it's very confusing for people to understand it because of the reason that you suggested. And I think, the ACCC is getting pretty aggressive on greenwashing claims as well, which is a good thing. And I think, some of those claims are pretty outrageous. The other thing also is that, things change all the time, right? And as the science changes and as the need to hit 1.5 degrees and that becomes more challenging, things change. So even on green bonds, for example, what were considered green bonds, maybe like gas, going from coal to gas, is no longer considered a transition bond. That is, and so, and then it's interesting, in the US, on the IRA, they changed the rules recently that if you wanted to get funding for hydrogen, it had to be green hydrogen, you couldn't go gas to hydrogen. And that's a really interesting, that's just a good example of the whole debate around transition, which is that, without expressing a view on it, there's a lot of hydrogen. We'll start up with gas, and then we'll then go to renewables to make the hydrogen. Is that acceptable? It was the IRA to begin with. Now they're saying, well, no, it's not. And that's a view you've got to take, right? But it's constantly evolving.
Okay, we have some questions from the crowd, and the first one is, which I've lost. I'm technologically challenged. It was about Sun Cable and what's happened with it and what do you see happening there. I'll frame it a lot better when I get the actual question back. Thanks, Nathan.
I mean, I've got to be careful here because I had a bit of visibility on this in my former role, so I know a little bit more than what's in the public, or can be in the public domain. But the way I'd describe it as, so Sun Cable, for those who don't know, it's generating a lot of solar in the NT, about 800 k's south of Darwin, something like that. Transmitting that cable, those green electrons up to Darwin, then putting it on a cable and sending it to Singapore. So where that is, and that was a joint proposition between Cannon Brooks and Andrew Forrest, where that separated last year, and Cannon Brooks has full carriage of that, and Quinbrook is doing the development of that project now. The way I would describe it now is the concept of generating all that solar in Darwin, in the Northern Territory, and then sending it on a cable to Darwin makes that part absolutely stacks up. Quinbrook very confident that's going to work. And this partly comes to what I was talking about earlier. What you do with the green electrons from there is a more debatable proposition. Whether that's in a cable, and my doubt there is actually the physics of a cable that big actually working, I think, is in question as much as not so much the economics necessarily. It's just whether the cable can actually hang together, literally. But get those green electrons to Darwin, to Middle Arm, which is where Quinbrook's got a site. Then what you do with them, I think, is a very open question. And I make a disclosure here. So Taiwan actually happens to have the plot of land right next door to Quinbrook in Middle Arm, so we're quite interested in their green electrons arriving there and what that might imply in terms of batteries and the like. But that's where Sun Cable is at the moment. So I think that's a really good example of getting the green electrons, and then a lot more open question as to what exactly you do with them. Is it exported in the form of hydrogen? Is it exported in the form in critical minerals, or what? And that still remained, and Quinbrook's very much looking at that as an open question.
So the only comment I'd make is that, and I'm in no ability to say whether it's viable or not in terms of the physics of it, but the concept of transporting electricity under the sea is nothing special. We do it between Tasmania and Australia. Tasmania and mainland Australia. That's what we do. So, in one sense, if we're going to be a superpower of energy, then as Guy says, we've got all these opportunities to create many different forms of energy, and there are many different ways to transport that. And we still haven't, solved one of the biggest issues of transporting hydrogen is the safety issue, right? How do you actually transport? And so there's a lot of work going on that. I noticed today ARENA funded quite a large new project to transport, I think it was hydrogen, but with Vast Solar and others. So this is as Kerry said, it's constantly evolving. We've got to we've got to take some risks. We've got to see what can work. And so, all these to me are pretty interesting developments, and if people want to back them and put their money into it, it's going to be interesting to see how they play out.
Just on the transport of hydrogen, AGL's been mucking about with that particular question at the Port of Hastings and working with the Japanese, and has successfully, the Japanese are really mainly carrying this, have successfully shipped hydrogen to Japan. It's very difficult to transport because it has to be at very low temperatures in particular types of vessels. And this isn't green hydrogen, it was actually made from Loy Yang A coal, but the purpose of it was to just try and do a pilot run of seeing if this boat actually worked. And yes, it did, but whether or not that's the answer to shipping hydrogen, who's to tell at this juncture?
Great, thank you. Kerry, this one might be for you as well. What policy changes could the state and federal governments do to incentivise adoption of green energy from grassroots? For example, the EV sector incentives have not been effective at a social scale to this point.
I think the EV incentives are probably going to be effective because with EVs in other jurisdictions, what we've noticed is that when it gets to about 8 or 10%, it suddenly really starts ramping up in terms of penetration, and we're at that we're at about that tipping point now. I think the one thing that the competition, the ACCC has been drawing attention to, has been a charge on vehicles that was actually, all vehicles, that was actually put there to protect an existing Australian industry, which of course doesn't exist anymore, so it don't need to protect it because we wiped it out. But it is actually being levied on EVs coming in. And if we didn't have that there, that would greatly help the take-up too and make them less expensive for everyone.
Next question is microgrid, the future of grid-based problems.
Just in terms of microgrids, there's quite a lot of successful microgrids in operation now in remote areas, and Broken Hill's basically running on almost a microgrid at the moment, even though it's not such a small place. I don't doubt that they're going to be quite successful in some remote and regional towns as well as remote communities where they already are. I think what we haven't yet worked out how to do, we know technically how to do this, but all of the pieces are not yet put together, is how to orchestrate household solar and storage together so that you can have quite a large aggregate of energy to trade on the wholesale market to the benefit of those households and whoever's doing the orchestration. So we know how to orchestrate things, but at the moment, how to just get all of that done is not clear. It's a nice software problem, not a difficult one, but it does raise issues for the regulators.
One point I think which is we've got to think about hard, and I'll defer to Kerry's expertise on this, but in the end, I mean, an electricity grid is a network, and I think if you end up with each household, we've got to be careful we don't lose the benefits of a network with everyone trying to become energy independent. That's not necessarily the most, probably almost definitely not the most efficient way of dealing with generation. So I think the way each household thinks about it is how can I get off the network as quickly as possible because I'm incentivised by the cost to do that. Whereas actually from the system point of view, you actually want to, as Kerry just said, you want to harness all of that and use it in the network. And I think we've got to be careful we don't, in heading micro, we don't use the benefits of the macro benefits of a network.
Yeah, that's absolutely right, which is why retailers are looking at orchestrating like a block of houses or a group of houses in a particular suburb or whatever together in terms of using their generation and their storage, but orchestrating it all together as a single unit that can then play within the whole grid in a way that is much more efficient for everybody. There's a lot of hurdles in the way of getting that to work, but they're not particularly technical.
Great. Next question. There's a pilot project in which green energy solutions will be deployed across Southeast Asia. We mainly use European and Chinese technologies, know-how and funds. How could Australia be part of the value chain?
Just elaborate the question a little bit more.
What was that? Go through the question again. So there's a pilot project in which green energy solutions will be deployed across Southeast Asia. We mainly use European and Chinese technologies, know-how and funds, and how can Australia be a bigger part of the value chain?
So I think one of the challenges we've got to actually, this comes back to the example I was giving before about building the value chain. So you have to accept that there are certain things we just can't produce in Australia because of cost. So then you have to actually take a step back and think, okay, well, how do I position Australia as a country that can take a leadership role in doing that? So the solar example I gave before was a good one. I'll give another example, which we haven't talked about yet, which is sustainable aviation fuel. So if you take the view, well, don't take the view, I mean, the reality is the only way to reduce emissions in aircraft directly is through SAF. And you need to have sustainable aviation fuel grown. So we've sort of been stumbling along here about how we do that. We've been having, there's been a lot of research done by a lot of people over many, many years. And there's now a few pilot projects here and there. There's a feedstock problem with tallow in Australia. A lot of that's already been contracted out to overseas. So Australia should be taking a step back and thinking of the big picture. We want the aviation industry in Australia to be 80% SAF by 2030. So what's that going to require? It's going to require this amount of land, this amount of supply sources into that SAF. It's going to require this amount of production sources within this vicinity to airports and this logistics to get there. And then you say to a company like, you say to the 3 or 4 refiners in Australia, not many, we will back you, the government will back you to go and do this. And each of you try to aim to get 25% of that market or 50%, whatever you want to do, and be the major supplier of SAF in this country. You need to have vision and you need to have a roadmap like that to actually have it and then have it backed by and then build the entire supply chain. If we do that, I mean, there's plenty of international offtake for that SAF already. I mean, it's all there. It's looking at Australia, and a lot of the SAF growers who are getting IRA funding are also looking at Australia, but it's piecemeal and slow. So we've got to find a way to sort of build those supply chains. And the solar one example I gave before is another good example of that.
I mean, I'll throw another one in, which is green ammonia. So the shipping industry, we're talking about solving fuel challenges for various parts of the global transport infrastructure. So shipping, not guaranteed it's going down green ammonia, but probably more likely than not at this point. So Australia has the potential to produce that green ammonia if we get those green electrons up and running. And that, if we're one of the major players in that, then we are having, the export expertise and the technology both upstream and downstream from that. There's a much more likely it will deploy here rather than somewhere else. And I think those are the sort of opportunities. The other thing I think to think about, from a very basic economic point of view, we haven't really thought. Most of the time, we don't think too much about energy and the production function. Now there's a premium on green energy being in the production function. The Europeans are very much there. They've got the carbon border adjustment mechanism to very much incentivise people that we actually want this product to be green from the whole way up the supply chain. So we're very lucky that we have the capacity to be able to do that. The Japanese can't do that without using our green fuel. So actually that gives us a much more of an advantage in other aspects of the production function than we had in the past, because it probably makes more sense to use the green electron here rather than necessarily ship it to the Japans and the Koreas of the world and let them add the value to it. So that does open up that potential and allow us to participate in a different way into Southeast Asia than we have in the past.
And I think just finally, just on all of that, there is an overlay of the China dynamic, right? And there is part of the reason is international jurisdictions are looking at us for fuel and for minerals, etc., is because it's an alternative supply to China. That's the reality of the geopolitics of it.
Perhaps a few questions as we move to wrapping up, and something to direct to all the panellists. What's something that makes you really optimistic and excited in this space, and what's something that keeps you awake at night? Maybe you first, Kerry.
I look at South Australia and think we really shouldn't give up on what we're doing, because it's a small jurisdiction, but it's currently running on average on renewables at about 80% of the time. And that's really very good, and we're probably never going to do much better without a lot more change. But South Australia is running on renewables for many hours of the day, and when the sun disappears, they're mainly switching to wind, and they're really only using gas and imported electricity from Victoria, which is basically black. Very few hours of their day across the 24 hours. And they're sort of like an optimistic canary in a coal mine for me, because if South Australia can do it, the rest of the jurisdictions can do it. And I'm leaving Tassie aside for the moment because they're 100% renewables because of their hydro, and as long as they've got plenty of water, they're in a blessed position. But for the rest of us, we're getting close to about 40 or 50% renewables, and South Australia was in that position probably only 5 or 6 years ago. So we really can do this. Everybody needs to just cheer up a little bit about it, including me, I think.
So does anything keep you awake at night, or are you filled with optimism?
Look, I went to, the environment keeps me awake at night, and not getting to 1.5 keeps me awake at night. And the fact that Australia is one of the largest methane emitters in the world, we must never forget, because a lot of people think, oh, we're a small country, we shouldn't be worrying about our emissions. But you look at our methane emissions and we're right up there.
Martijn?
I think I'll start the other way around. What keeps me awake is, the failure to properly get to 1.5, and secondly, the massive biodiversity loss that we're facing, which is extraordinary. And I think also just the fact that a lot of corporate Australia still is not on the journey, and that is sort of quite concerning. But I think on the bright side, there's a lot of momentum. There's incredible technologies emerging all the time, and the rate at which things change is phenomenal. So as long as we can get the financing to move that along and get a lot of that adopted, experiment, and prepare to take a bit of risk, and adopt an attitude there, then that's really exciting from my perspective.
So as a proud South Australian, Kerry's already stolen my thunder, and you shouldn't just say, if South Australia can do it, then anyone can do it. That's South Australia has been just benefit of particularly an East Coast audience, just making sure that point isn't taken away. But actually, that does show that actually and I would say mostly bipartisan in South Australia, but a fairly clear vision as to how to move ahead actually bears fruit. And South Australia, unlike most of the rest of the country, didn't have quite so much of a lost decade. They stuck Elon's battery in there, and which at the time was world leading, and now is regarded as a sort of old hat and a bit passé. And the other point of optimism there, which is I've got to be careful because we're at a Macquarie Uni function rather than an Adelaide Uni function. But actually, what's interesting is that now students, and particularly postgrad students, want to come to South Australia, and because they've actually got stuff on the ground where they can see things happening in real time. So I think that there is that potential for Australia to get there. So that, I think, is the optimistic story. My concern really is that we've dragged our feet for the better part of a decade. We're making progress now, but I think that the overall framework that we've got in place is broadly consistent in laying the building blocks. What frustrates me is the really slow follow through on that, and maybe that's mostly in the end on the corporate side, is that, for a long time it was corporate Australia, or parts of corporate Australia at least, and the finance sector way in front of the government. Government's now made a reasonable effort at the federal level at least, the states had already been there mostly, to catch up. And now it's back on deploying behind that framework, and that just seems to be taking way longer. And I think to some extent you've got to remember why we're doing all of this, and it's not just for the hell of it, it's actually to avoid us going to hell, and in terms of the climate. And every year that we're not deploying as much renewable capacity as we should be and as we could be is another year that the planet's getting that much warmer than it should be.
Yeah, and just some of those comments just made me think of two other points I just wanted to make. One is that the other thing that's optimistic is the R&D in the universities, because we are here at Macquarie Uni function, but some of the people I've spoken to in the last 6 months just around NRF at the CSIRO and the unis, some of the stuff that is being done is mind-blowing. And how far Australia is on leading on a lot of that is actually really interesting. And then I think secondly, the other thing is that in a lot of the roles I've had with CFC and ARENA and NRF, the thing I often hear from the naysayers is it can't be done. And so many of the things they say can't be done, you say, actually, it's already being done. And when we did the reverse auction for large-scale solar in Australia with ARENA and the CFC, all the Australian players said it can't be done. And at the end of the day, it was all the international players that came in and just did it, and it just got done within 6 months in terms of the offers and through the system. So I think if you get depressed because people say things can't be done, the fact is you just get on and do it. I think at the end of the day, there is so much opportunity out there, and there are a lot of people who are willing to do it, and we've just got to back it.
That's a beautiful note to finish on. Thank you very much all. Please join me in thanking our wonderful panel.